Hey everyone, Matt Thomas here. Thanks for watching. So this is the video version of the live workshop that I did. If you were at the live workshop, thank you so much for being there. I really appreciate it. You'll also notice if you're watching this video and you were at the live workshop, you'll notice I'm going to skip a lot of things that I did at the live workshop because I did demo like how we remember things and how to spotlight certain things, but it works best live, not so much on video. So I'm going to kind of skip that whole part of it. And so I think it's so important to know how memories are made, because memories are made very consistently, just like the brain learns very consistently. And if we as teachers know how our students are going to remember things better, then we can teach that way, right? It's more efficient for us. It'll be more enjoyable for the students. So here we go. So just a real quick review of the last workshop, because this is kind of part 2 of a workshop. So how the brain learns. I use this analogy of learning something new is like a new tree growing or a new tree branch. So whenever someone learns something new, a neural pathway is sprouting or growing in their brain, just like a tree would be growing a new tree, right? And so to keep that tree alive, you got to keep watering the tree. You have to keep repeating the information so that it stays in the student's brain. Because if not, the brain's just going to repurpose that neural pathway, those cells, for use elsewhere. And then root the information or connect it with something the student already knows. That makes it much easier for students to remember. And of course, the most important aspect of learning is get our students curious, get them interested in what we're doing. So let's continue on. So essentially, how memories are made. So like the real quick version, I used a big analogy in the live workshop. I'll do a real quick version here. Essentially, our senses grab everything that they can when we walk into a room, or any information we hear, we're grabbing all that information and then asking the hippocampus if it's important enough to remember. And the hippocampus will decide whether it's going to be in memory or not. It's usually bases it on whether we've experienced that information before or our brain finds it important enough for survival. So we as teachers think things are important, but it's the student's brain that actually will decide what it wants to remember. And that's based on, like I said, a connection to what the student has done before. It could be interest level. It could be if the brain realizes like, hey, this is really important. And so knowing all that, as teachers, it's important for us to spotlight the information that we want our students to remember. I'm going to bring that up a little bit later on. If you're watching the slideshow, you see I'm referencing Barney here. That is something that we did in the live workshop. All right, so what our brain remembers, what our students' brains will remember, what our brains will remember, our brain will remember information that it finds important. And so as teachers, we want to spotlight what we want our students to remember. So if we're doing chapter 4 and we're throwing all the information in chapter 4 at them, our students are not going to remember everything. So we as teachers need to go, all right, what is the most important information that we want our students to know? And really spotlight that, focus on that. And our brains will remember like information that it can connect to its real world, right? A real world relevance. Our brains remember information that's repeated. So we want to constantly repeat the information that we want our students to know. Our brains will remember information that has an emotional connection connected to it, good and bad memories, right? So we want to try to see if we can find some emotional connection that we can make to that information. I'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Our brains will remember information that's connected with other information, like with use of effective quick writes, things like that. Try to connect what we're trying to teach to something the students already know. And of course, our students will remember information that it finds curious about, right? So we're born with this innate ability to learn. And it starts with curiosity. It starts with interest. And I always say this example. I got into neuroscience almost 7 years ago. And I know that because my daughter's 6 now. And so when my wife was pregnant, I knew I had one shot to be a great dad. Like I didn't want to mess it up. And so I started reading all the brain development books so I can support my daughter's development, right? And so that totally sparked my interest in neuroscience and my curiosity. And then it's led to where it is now. And so that all started just with curiosity, with interest. So if we get our students interested in what we're teaching, they're going to pay attention. So how does this information help us as teachers? So our students, right, their senses, their senses will grab everything, but it's only going to retain certain information. most of what we teach our students will not be retained. So as teachers, we need to choose wisely and spotlight the information we really want them to know. We need to focus on fewer concepts, but more opportunities to master those concepts. So that's Finland and Singapore's exact education model, two of the best education systems in the world. They focus on fewer concepts, more opportunities to master those concepts. I'll talk about a cross-curriculum instruction exercises that I've done with Mr. Paulson, AP Human Geography teacher. I'll talk about that in a second. So we also, as teachers, want to try to connect the information that we're teaching to the students by having a real world purpose for them. Again, it's their brain that decides if it wants to retain the information or not. Not always the students, because sometimes even with adults, we're trying to go like, okay, I want to remember that information, I got to remember that, and then we just forget it because our brain was the one that actually decides whether information is important enough to remember. Not always us consciously, right? So to help our students retain the information, we want to try to connect a real world purpose to what we're teaching, and not just say it's because of the state standards, because that's an us thing as teachers. That's not a student thing. The students don't care. And so we want to try to connect, like if they say, when am I going to use this in school? Or why are we learning this in school? And you're like, it's part of the state standards. That doesn't mean that much to them. We want to try to develop it in a way that's like, hey, the reason that you're learning this in school is because here's where you'll use it in real life. It'll make it easier for their brain to remember that information. So let me talk quickly about cross-curricular instruction. It's one of the best methods of teaching. I have a video, I've linked my video here on that. You can watch that when you have a chance. So Mr. Paulson, Andrew Paulson, a great AP Human Geography teacher, he and I used to do cross-curricular instruction units. We used to do 4 a year. And the one we did was the migration unit. So he did his migration unit at the same time I did my biographical writing unit. And during his migration unit, he would focus on 2 terms. Push-pull factors. And he would talk about why people migrated from one place to another. What was pulling them to one place or pushing them away from another, right? Push-pull factors. And so while he was doing that, I would also use those terms when I would have my students interview someone a generation older. And one of the parts of the interview was they would have to ask the person what pushed them away from where they were and what pulled them to where they are now. And so I would reiterate or reinforce that push-pull factor terms. And I kept doing it all throughout the year when I would talk character motivations during novels and short stories, like what influenced the character to do this. Characters plotted out, sympathetic characters, why are we pulled or drawn to certain characters more than others? Poetry analysis, I'm a big believer that for someone to really analyze poetry correctly, that person needs to research what was going on in the author's real life at the time that the author was writing that poem, like what was influencing or pushing that author to write that, author's purpose, methods of persuasion, etc. So I kept all throughout the year like repeating that push-pull factor term. So our students really got to learn that. That can also be done in history when they're talking about wars, like what pushed a nation into wars or what influenced or pulled the nation into doing that. Economics, math, college and career foundation with life paths. So you can do cross-curricular instruction, not just like by 2 classes at a time, you can include a 3rd or 4th class. Anyway, there's a video there if you want to see it. So how do we help our students remember? One is, as teachers, we need to spotlight what we want our students to remember. Really focus on those key things we want them to remember. Fewer concepts, more opportunities to learn them. We need to connect that information to what the students already know, preferably some type of an emotional connection. I mentioned this too at times when English teachers are teaching poetry. If your students aren't involved with poetry or they don't enjoy poetry, teach poetry using music lyrics from songs that they love, that they really enjoy. That connects it emotionally. We need to repeat the information, not just within a week, but throughout the year. Really repeat that important information we want our students to remember. Give them a real world purpose, right? Of connecting that information you're teaching to their real world. This is where your life knowledge comes in. Like as teachers, gosh, we have so much knowledge that we can share that goes above and beyond the textbook, right? Bring in your hobbies, your skills, careers you did before you were a teacher, and bring that life knowledge in. And so connect what's being taught in the textbook to the reality of life. And really important, we need to create that curiosity within our students and that interest level with them. So as a teacher, when you're creating a lesson, how to develop a memorable lesson, ask yourself as a teacher, as you're creating it, what's your end goal? What do you want your teachers to have mastered at the end of this lesson or at the end of this unit? Choose wisely though, right? Choose the most important information and spotlight that information. How you're teaching support that end goal, right? And how does what you're teaching support the students' preparation for after high school? That's one way they'll really remember the information. How can you create that real world or personal connection with each unit, with each lesson? And how can you create some emotion with that unit? So whether it be that they're just having fun, that they enjoy the lesson, catharsis, maybe they just want to journal and just let everything out, passion, something that they're passionate about. And if you don't do these things, most likely the information will be forgotten. So here are a few lesson plan examples that I put together. Now, I always preface by saying this. I'm an English teacher, so this is all from the perspective of an English teacher. So if you're a science teacher and you go, Matt, that lesson's not going to work, please focus on my message rather than my delivery or my application, right? So if you're like, Matt, that's a lame lesson, I'm focusing on less is more. So please kind of focus on the message than the actual lesson. But okay, so as an English teacher, many of you have seen this video already. I've linked it here. My students would write 22 essays a year. Now before you go, dude, that's a lot. Well, I would only highlight 4 of them and call them essays. The rest were written projects, but they were all written in a way that supported the Axes paragraph model. And so the students were doing the same type of writing, though it was writing in different subjects and so on. So they got practice writing 22 different times, but they did it in writing satires and character analysis and doing speeches and infomercials and business proposals. The Axes paragraph model really can be connected into all those formats. So my students were repeating the same information multiple times. I did it with marketing analysis and argumentative writing. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So if I were doing modes of persuasion, like ethos, pathos, logos, audience, I talked about that in marketing, argumentative writing, satires, elements of speech, character analysis. I would reiterate that information, ethos, pathos, logos, audience, all throughout the year. So the students really got good at that. And I would create that personal connection by asking the students, hey, which one of your parents the logical one or the emotional one? Or do you know which one to go to when you're asking certain questions? They're like, yeah, we do. So they already know this stuff. So I created that personal connection with them. If I were a history teacher, I might have my students do a historical figure project where I'm not having them memorize 30 historical figures, but I'm having them focus on just a couple or one specific historical figure. Again, fewer concepts, focus on importance. And I'd have the students research that historical figure's viewpoints or ideologies. And then I would have that student create a podcast or a video interview where the student would play both roles. So the student might be like, hey, Darwin, what do you think about this? And then the student would pretend to be the other person and be like, well, I feel that. And they would answer using the answers that figure would use, right? Because the students would have to research the ideologies of that figure. And also, not only does it allow them to really focus on one character or one historical figure that they can know really well, it also teaches them how to do a podcast or how to do video interviews, right? YouTube videos, something that can be practical for them. If I'm doing math, now first of all, math is so challenging because math is more prone to synaptic pruning, which is the brain essentially repurposing those neural pathway circuits or deleting information at the end of the day that it doesn't find as relevant as others. And math is more prone to synaptic pruning because of all the specific vocab that math has that students have to memorize. So that's always so challenging. So this example, I got it from another math teacher about if the students are learning a new math formula to create a word problem representing that mathematical formula. So this word problem here is about someone who's going on a date and wants to make sure that he has enough money to pay for the date. So you can see it's trying to figure out this mathematical equation to figure out how much money he has. And maybe you could spark interest by starting the lesson by hey, let's say you're on a date and the person who's paying doesn't have enough money. How are you going to feel about that person, etc. I also have linked 2 math videos, innovative ways to teach math from the perspective of a mathematician, and then why is math so difficult to remember. Biology, if you're teaching photosynthesis, have students plant trees around the campus. Like each student has their own tree and they have to plant it around campus. And it goes above and beyond like third grade. They stick the avocado thing in the bowl, in the cup with the, toothpicks. It goes beyond that because now like every 2 weeks you can go visit the trees and each student can be like, dude, my tree is growing. And if they're a freshman, by the time they're a senior, they could see their tree actually growing on campus, So anyway, and then, so that's a little, some examples there. Finally, as this video ends up, as a review, spotlight what your students want to remember. Spotlight what you want your students to remember. Connect it to what they already know, preferably some emotional connection. Repeat that information. Give that information a real world purpose and create that curiosity in your class. Get your students interested and understand they will not remember everything you want them to know. So choose wisely and repeat that important, or the information that you feel is very important. And please understand, out of all the neuroscience I've done through the years, one thing I can tell you 100%, with total certainty, our students can learn whatever we want to teach them, as long as we make it accessible to them. So don't ever think that something's too difficult or that text is too difficult for them to learn. Not at all. We just need to make it accessible to them, connect it to what they already know, teach it in a way that they're like, I get it, and they can learn it for sure. So, okay, the end was just a couple other things that I randomly talked about in the live workshop. I'll stop this here. Thank you guys so much for watching.